Hi everyone, I'm Sumaya,
I'm Essie.
and today we'll be presenting on the African American struggle lack of higher education leads to excessive incarceration rates.
This is our final presentation for our sociology class. First, we'll be talking about our research topic and its significance. So, we decided to report on African Americans' high imprisonment rates and low college enrollment rates. In the United States, African American individuals are reported to be enrolled in and successfully complete college at a rate that is substantially lower than students of other races. It has also been reported that African American individuals are the leading numbers in over imprisonment in the US. And this is a topic that is very prevalent in the African American community, which we're both a part of, which is why we decided to choose to talk about this.
This is significant because systematic disadvantages prevent the Black community to thrive in a way that others can, and also leads to subsequent prejudice and misunderstanding of the Black experience. By learning the correlation between these issues, one can not only grasp the issues African Americans must face, but can also work towards making a change.
This topic was an important issue for us to talk about because we feel as though often Black people are kind of not afforded the same opportunities to get into higher education like we're able to, like a school such as this. And we realize that a lot of people who aren't able to have that opportunity to go to college, especially more prestigious institutions, often end up in situations that are not very fortunate, like being in prison. And we kind of wanted to explore why that is such an issue and what we as people can kind of do to combat that in the future.
So, the concepts we're going to be talking about today are white privilege, subordinate groups, discrimination, segregation, minority groups, racism, wealth, lower class, socioeconomic status, stereotype, and prejudice.
So now we're going to go over what our thesis was. The Black community's historic lack of access to higher education leads to young African Americans being much more at risk of imprisonment. Some of the statistics that we found that connected these two events is according to the census's American Community Survey, in 2022, 12% of the total US population identified as Black or African American, and among Black residents aged 25 or over, only 25.4% had earned a bachelor's degree or higher. African Americans in the US make up roughly 13% of the population. However, they constitute 38% of the prison population. So once we kind of found all these statistics and did our analysis, we came up with this thesis, which is the historic exclusion of African Americans in higher education due to systematic racism, segregation, and discriminatory policies have created inequalities in educational access. And as a result of this, African Americans are much more at risk of excessive imprisonment. So now we're going to start with our analysis. Before we got into studying the correlation between lack of higher education and imprisonment rates, we wanted to kind of explore why Black people have even been put in this kind of situation to begin with, like a access of higher education. So doing that, we went and took a look back all the way to slavery and how it connects to a lack of access to higher education.
So, in our first body paragraph, we talked about African Americans being denied the right to education for 300 years and its lasting impact into today. So, while white Americans, unlike many minority groups, are given free and easily attainable access to many of society's resources, African Americans had to fight long and hard to obtain these same privileges, and one of the most of them being the right to education. It took African Americans 300 years of torture, belittling, dehumanization, and generational suffering before they were granted their right to education in America.
So, a reading that we found evidence for this in was actually the first reading that we did in this class, which was from The Souls of Black Folks by W.E. Du Bois, who's actually a very, very popular African American sociologist. And he said, he simply wishes to make it possible for a man to be both a Negro and an American, without being cursed and spit upon by his fellows, without having the doors of opportunity closed roughly in his face. And he also said, work, culture, liberty, all these we need, not singly but not together, or together, not successively but together, each growing and aiding each, and all striving toward that vaster ideal that swims before the Negro people, the ideal of human brotherhood gained through the unifying ideal of race.
So, throughout his first chapter, Dubois claims that African Americans are incessantly unrecognized by the rest of the world and that they exhibit the same abilities, talents, and potential when it comes to education, reason, and knowledge. However, their same talents continue to go unnoticed and ignored by the rest of society because their brown skin color puts them at a disadvantage to be considered great. He goes on to share throughout this chapter that Black people in America must use this hatred from society as fuel to propel forward and continue to excel. The recurring emphasis on not letting society discourage African Americans from the education system in his paper showcases how affected African Americans were by the institutional racism that became normalized in society.
So, after kind of exploring what the context, historical context of this issue was, we then talked about it in the present and realized that inequitable resources to higher education and lack of access to supplemental school programs for Black and poor students is kind of what led to a lack of access to higher education. As a result of racist practices such as redlining, where certain services, especially financial, are not offered to a specific area because of the amount of minority groups living there, African Americans have been forced to accept unfortunate and not helpful resources that they've been offered. And exploring the value that schools place into prospective students' SAT scores and how that practice can negatively impact students of color who fall closer to or below the poverty line, especially when one considers the amount of supplemental support and funding needed to participate in these kind of programs that help students succeed on standardized tests such as these. It's kind of what explains why it's so hard for a lot of Black students to be able to have access to colleges, especially ones that require you to submit standardized testing scores like SAT or ACT scores.
Some of the quotes that we pulled from this reading that support this is simply put, poor students among whose Black and Hispanic are overrepresented average lower test scores than their wealthy and non minority counterparts because they are significantly more likely to attend underperforming resource poor schools. And standardized testing is biased against women, minorities, and students from low socioeconomic backgrounds.
And we found that these quotes supported this point that a lack of access to things that help you score better on SATs or even go to schools that offer more AP classes are often what leads people to be able to get into better institutions. And because Black students are often put in areas that don't have these kind of resources, it automatically makes it harder for them to have access to schools like that.
So now in our third body paragraph, we connected it to mass incarceration and how racial profiling plays a part in that. So since African Americans are typically victims of demonization by law enforcement, namely white police officers, it leads to an almost intrinsic assumption made by these aggressors that Black people are typically in the wrong in criminal proceedings or arrest-related encounters. This clear boundary created to confine certain minority groups to areas that allow them to be placed under unfair surveillance directly relates to the same redlining that prevents access to financial security and thus higher education, creating an almost inescapable cycle for those it affects.
In this reading, we found a quote that had a clear statistic about this, which said 30% of those with only high school diplomas have been to prison, and 60% of those who did not finish high school have prison records by their mid 30s. And this is referring to Black men. And even though this statistic doesn't relate to higher education directly, it's a clear example that if even people who can't finish high school are automatically kind of in the running to be more likely to end up in prison, it's even harder to have access to higher education and not end up in that kind of same position.
And then we pulled a quote from Racism Without Racist by Eduardo Bonilla Silva. Blacks and dark skinned Latinos are the targets of racial profiling by the police that, combined with the highly racialized criminal court system, guarantees their overrepresentation among those arrested, prosecuted, incarcerated, and executed.
And in this book about mass incarceration, it had two quotes that kind of stood out to us. Racially biased police discretion is key to understanding how the overwhelming majority of people who get swept into the criminal justice system turn out to be Black or brown, even though the police adamantly deny that they engage in racial profiling. Police have discretion regarding whom to target and as well as where to target. And the hypersegregation of the poor Black ghetto communities has made the roundup much easier. Confined to ghetto areas and lacking political power, the Black community are convenient targets. And this kind of just connects back to the fact that since Black people are often placed in areas that make them less fortunate, police and law enforcement target those areas and overpolice them more, putting them more at risk of being incarcerated at higher rates than any other race of people.
Okay, so now this is the conclusion that we came to. In result, it is clear that the past oppression, ridicule, and outright racist actions and remarks have negatively affected African Americans in the education system. To be denied access to education for so many years, the African American community was forced to abandon the idea of pursuing a career centered in education. Being one of the most impoverished groups in society, many African Americans struggle to provide financially when it comes to seeking academic help. Due to this, young African American scholars become discouraged to excel in a system that wasn't created for them to succeed in. In predominantly African American neighborhoods, most young black men become victims of the school to prison pipeline. Oftentimes, these communities lack support from educational institutions because they are seen as incapable of reaching the same level of academic greatness as whites. Again, it is evident that the system disregards the needs of Black individuals to be seen as capable of attaining positions in higher education. Therefore, many Black individuals are at risk of excessive imprisonment. The racist ideals that prohibited Black individuals from seeking greatness are the same that consider African Americans a violent threat to society.
So these are all the references that we used throughout our presentation. And thank you for
Thank
listening.
you.